Yes, okay. So I'll stand for a second. I'm Diane Kresh. I'm the director of Arlington Library. Welcome to Arlington Reads. This is our 8th year of doing Arlington Reads, which is hard to believe. So yes, thank you. We do it each year because of all of you. We have a great time every year. We always have a terrific lineup of authors, and the whole thing wouldn't be possible without the Friends of the Library. So let's also give it up for the Friends. And then later this month, we'll have the first of our 2 annual book sales, and it's the longest recycling program in Arlington. So we hope to see you there. We always have a lot of fun at that as well. So again, thank you to the Friends. So tonight, we're delighted to have Dinaw Mengestu with us to talk about his absolutely fabulous book, The Beautiful Things That Heaven Bears. We want to do something a little bit differently tonight. I will pose some questions to Dinaw, but then I want to pause and invite questions or comments from you all so that we can make this more of a conversation. So the first part, I'll do a little background, roots, that kind of thing, and then we'll invite you to participate in that. And then we'll talk a little bit about the book, and then at some point, Dinaw will actually read from the book, which will be wonderful. And then at the end, we'll kind of talk about what's next in his life and what he's doing and that sort of thing. So that's roughly the format. We do have interpretation here this evening. It is being taped by AVN, so you'll be able to watch it later again and again and again. And that'll be a nice reminder. So the other piece that we thought we would do a little differently, if you don't have a chance to share a personal story this evening, but would like to, we'll open up that possibility on our website so that people can keep the conversation going after this evening about what you heard or your experience of the immigrant experience, whether it's been your story or the story of someone you're close to. We want to continue the conversation and share and learn from one another. So that'll be something to look forward to on our website. Okay? So let's start then. Hello.
Hello.
We had a chance to get acquainted a little bit earlier. A couple of biographical things. Mr. Mengestu was born in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia in 1978 and came to the U.S. at the age of 2, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. He attended Georgetown as an undergrad and received an MFA in fiction from Columbia. He also received a fellowship from the New York Foundation for the Arts, was named a 5 Under 35 award winner by the National Book Award Foundation, and last year, probably most excitingly and maybe terrorizing at the same time, he's received a Genius Grant from the MacArthur Foundation, and we'll hopefully have a chance to talk a little bit about that. He is the author of 3 books. We're talking about his first one this evening, and if we have time, we would like to get into the second 2, because as I've begun reading them, they are related, although not necessarily as a sequel. So without anything further, we'll talk about the book, and so much of what I found in the novel was on the theme of fitting in. And you came here when you were 2 from Ethiopia and grew up in Peoria and then later in Chicago. So can you talk a little bit about what it was like to assimilate into the American way of life? And did you ever think of yourself as different? And if you didn't, did there come a time when you did and you wanted to explore that further?
Good evening. Thank you all very much for coming here. Before I launch into a very complex answer about my 2 years in life, my first years in life, I want to say thank you very much to the Arlington Public Library for bringing me here, for all of the support you've provided, for assisting in sponsoring this event with ECDC. It's been a great pleasure working with you guys. And to friends and family who are also here. Oh, I'm sorry, I have to speak up. And to friends who and family who are also here, pleasure to see you again. As for this question of whether or not, so the topic of the conversation is, I guess both my talk and Gino Deez's talk is under the rubric of the immigrant experience. And without a doubt, I definitely am an immigrant. At the same time, I came to America when I was 2 years old. And when you come to America as a 2-year-old, you don't really have any souvenirs or memories of the place that you've left. You grew up feeling completely American. and yet at the same time you grow up feeling completely American with a very profound understanding that there's an history and an antecedent that preceded you, that there's this cultural legacy that that is somehow essential to who you are, even though you don't quite have access to it. So I was talking about it with friends of mine the other day, that it's kind of like as if you grow up playing hopscotch all the time, you know? You're inside of the house and you're Ethiopian, then you go outside onto the playground and you jump the rope and you cross the line, and now you're American. You go back home and your father says, remember, you're Ethiopian, and then you go back outside to the swimming pool and you eat a hot dog. And these two seemingly disparate identities exist in a state of sometimes tension, and that seems to be one of the things that I remember the most growing up, is wondering exactly which side of the line I was supposed to be on and in which circumstances. And as I grew older, I think there was this sort of constant oscillation. That jump roping became more and more intense, where the less connected I felt to America, the more I decided that I needed to be Ethiopian. The more prejudice I experienced in America, the more I decided I needed to be Ethiopian as a way of resolving that prejudice. And then, of course, as you grow older, you begin to understand part of what makes America so unique is that it gives you this opportunity to actually become a part of it in a way that I don't think any country particularly does. And so gradually, bit by bit, you know, you learn to somehow merge those two competing strands. And it's never, I tend to try to argue for there's a unified whole that emerges out of this. There's a sense in which you can be both Ethiopian, both from any other country, and completely American at the same time, and that you're not holding these two identities in any opposition, but yet you are representative of something that's uniquely possible here in this country, that you can be both of these things, and that you can be both of them in a way that grants you a special space inside of this country. And at the same time, you know, you can't deny the fact that there is this unique divide, this unique sort of, you know, sort of form of double consciousness that you never really get to escape. But I think by and large, for me, it's been a great benefit for me. I think my work is kind of born out of that tension.
Okay. So I think I read, too, in an interview where you even talked for a while about not having a citizenship, that you wanted to kind of have these multiple identities. Do you still feel that way?
I don't necessarily feel that way. No, not anymore. I think when my parents both became citizens long before I did, and I decided when I was about 13 or 14 that I didn't want to become a U.S. citizen, out of, you know, for two reasons. One, that I was growing up in a very sort of I was in a high school that was quite homogenous, and it was the first time that I really had an experience of being both young and black and in America. And as you become a teenager, and as your identity becomes more contentious, and as you become an adult, suddenly you're faced with a lot more complications than you are as a child. And once I became aware of that identity, that I was not only male, but I was a black male in America, and especially in the Midwest, you realize there's a lot of frustration that comes with that I experienced. And so that made me not want to be American, because somehow I associated the complexities and challenges that came with that with being purely a product of America. And to some degree, that's true, that is. And by claiming to be Ethiopian, that releases you from that burden. Mm-hmm. Suddenly you're no longer able to be, you believe that no one can insult you anymore, that somehow you've created this privileged space that you get to exist in your fantasies and in your dreams where you are only Ethiopian. Mm-hmm. And I think it took a long time to sort of resolve that issue. And again, I think now I don't see those problems, right? I understand that there are complex racial issues inside of America, but those issues aren't the sort of totality of what it means to be inside of America as well. And again, I think there is something quite unique to this American experience that I've come to really admire and come to really respect, which is that you can become a part of it in a way that means it's not only just a question of sort of being born here or being granted a piece of paper or a passport. It's kind of an active choice that you can make. It's a sort of form of engagement that you can willfully sort of choose to take on. And when you willfully choose to take that on, I think you have a greater understanding of the burden and the responsibilities that come with that.
Right. When you were about in your later 20s, you actually went home to Ethiopia and to your grandmother's house, which had prior only been represented in a photo that your family had. So can you talk a little bit about what that experience was like, what motivated you to go back to begin with, and what you experienced when you got there?
Yeah. I always had, you know, I think like most immigrants, even though I left Ethiopia, as I said, as a child, I didn't have any particular memories of it, but there is a way in which I think nostalgia is inherited. You know, your parents can actually pass on many different traits. They can give you the color of your eyes, the texture of your hair, and they can also give you the things that they've lost and the things that they miss and the things that they love. And definitely, I think one of the things that you inherit as the son of immigrants and as an immigrant is you inherit the sense of this kind of lost cultural and historical landscape. And that can be both alienating and also at the same time, it could be sort of create this profound desire to want to be able to engage that part of your family's history, to want to engage and see this land. So I used to have these very profound fantasies of what it would be like when I first went to Ethiopia, that I'd walk off the plane and I'd step on the tarmac and I'd drop to my knees and people would like magically show up and start weeping with me. My father used to have this postcard of a lion that was the symbol of Ethiopian Airlines, and the lion looked to be on the tarmac, and I really actually thought that when I got to Ethiopia, when I was very small, that I'd get off the plane, I'd get on the tarmac, I'd start weeping, and the lion would suddenly come rolling out, and it would be this sort of great welcoming home. And so I always kind of really had a very deep, profound longing to go back to Ethiopia. And when I finally did, I think it sort of was interesting because it worked out in exactly the same time that I just actually finished my first novel. And that seemed to really make sense. So I'd written a novel that imagined a lot of things in Ethiopia that I'd never actually witnessed myself. I'm actually imagining Addis Ababa without ever having seen it. I'm imagining the death of family members that I never actually knew. And just as soon as that novel was completed, I had the opportunity to finally go to Ethiopia. And it was as profound and more profound and more remarkable of an experience than I'd ever imagined before. And yet at the same time, you can't just sort of praise all the great beauty. There is also this other side of it, which is that hopscotch game again. So as soon as I got to Ethiopia, everyone would look at me, and my hair wasn't quite so long back then, and everyone thought I was Ethiopian until the moment I opened and I spoke. And as soon as I spoke, then everyone's like, now we know who you are. You're an American, really, just sort of disguised as an Ethiopian. And so you were always quite aware of the fact that you were both inside and yet at the same time outside of this culture that you felt profoundly and emotionally attached to, and yet at the same time you also have to respect the distance that comes with migration. You can't. I think part of what it means to accept that immigrant legacy is to accept that there's a loss. There's a great gain and there's a great benefit, but there's a loss and you can't always recover from that loss. You can create something else out of that loss. In my case, it's creating fiction out of that. And it's not necessarily a pejorative or negative thing, but there is an absence that can't ever really be fulfilled. And so you have to kind of accept that and at the same time find ways of engaging that absence as honestly and truthfully as you can. So I was back in Ethiopia in the same house that I'd lived in as a child, and sure enough, inside of this house, there were all of these remarkable relics that had all stayed exactly the same way that they had been when we left at that point 25 years earlier. So the walls were there's still little stickers on the walls in the bedroom from when my sister and I were children. There was a painting on the wall that my father had bought when he was in Italy or in Saudi Arabia before he became an immigrant. I think my mother's in the back, so she'll know. All of my mom's shoes that were still inside of the house. And so you had a sense that somehow, even though you had left, this place was still waiting for you, that even though 25 years later, the house had kind of, it hadn't frozen itself. Life had gone on, and yet at the same time, I found something incredibly touching about the fact that this space kind of was holding its breath for us to return.
There's a nice part in the book where you're describing the narrator's uncle's apartment building, a 28-story building, 26 floors of which are filled with Ethiopians, intersecting lives, gossiping, talking about one another. Were it not for a fact of geography, you would think you were in Ethiopia. And it was something that the narrator can't wait to get away from, and the uncle can't leave. Can you talk a little bit about the Ethiopian diaspora and the role of Washington, D.C., which was pretty central to that?
I feel like there's people in the audience who could probably do better justice to that than I can.
Well, they'll have their turn in a second.
They will. I will say that one of my earliest memories as a child was coming to D.C. and whether or not this memory gets skewed with time and with history, is that we were, with my father coming up 18th Street, and every 20 minutes as we were walking up 18th Street, he'd run into another old high school friend. And I kept being like, how is this possible, right? Like, this doesn't make sense. I've never seen any other Ethiopians growing up, and suddenly we get to 18th Street, and there's one that graduated. That was my uncle, cousins, brothers. Everyone was a best friend every 5 feet. And it's obviously because those experiences get magnified in an immigrant context, right? So it's not that obviously all Ethiopians have suddenly moved to the Washington, D.C. area, but that within the amount of people that are able to actually become a part of the diaspora is already pretty small inside of a country, even a country as populous as Ethiopia. And so within that, then you start sort of huddling those people into certain large pockets across America, then inevitably you're going to find connections and you're going to find a way of finding pieces of your life all over the city. So for me, I mean, that's, and then since then I've spent a lot of time in the Washington, D.C. area. And when I first began writing fiction, I was always, I think, perhaps slightly cautious about trying to write about the Ethiopian experience in America. I didn't necessarily know if I had both the authority and whether or not there was really such a space that existed in American literature to write characters like that. And being in D.C., I think, was definitely part of what granted you that privilege, right? You had a sense that actually this was not a community that kind of existed on the margins or that existed purely in the abstract, but that was actually sort of central to what the city has become and is. And so knowing that, that actually allows you and gives you a sense that, well, there's something vital to this community, and there's a sort of narrative that is both a part of this community and much greater than that. That's also very much reflective of what an American experience is, and you can use that community then to sort of get at both the history of Ethiopia and also, I think, the kind of process of immigration that's very American.
Right. Okay, we'll pause. People want to start asking questions or sharing their own experience or comments? Okay, so the question is, why did his father went first and the family followed, but give the context of why they came here.
We left, my father left just before I was born, following the revolution in Ethiopia in 1974. And then in that sort of tumultuous period known as the Red Terror in Ethiopia, we lost family members who either ended up in prison or dead. And so my father left during that time. And why we ended up in Peoria, I think that was really just a question of where you ended up being resettled in the long run. So, there was a job that somebody helped him find at Caterpillar. And then it took 2 years for my mother, sister, and I to get out. And by that point, he had established a life in Peoria, and so we joined him there.
Okay, I work in an elementary school with a large population of children from all over the world. And I wondered, what words would you say to these young immigrants?
Those are always the easiest questions, right? Like, give us words of wisdom. I would probably say I understand the necessity of the way we make these distinctions between immigrants and non-immigrants, I suppose, right? But at the same time, it does seem to create a strange dialectic, and especially in an American context, right? That part of why you are here doesn't necessarily, that immigrant kind of almost automatically seems to place you on the outside to a certain degree. But really, I think there's another way that has to kind of be spun on its head to a certain degree. That part of what makes the sort of country so great is that every time somebody new enters it, that they expand its possibilities. They expand the definition of what it means to be American. So the American identity, the American ideal, the American dream is not a fixed, static thing by any possible measures, and every single one of them is a new contribution to that possibility. And so it's not so much that they're an immigrant, but they're another perspective, they're another voice, they're another reality, they're another presence, and every one of those presences continues to modify, expand, enrich, enliven our possibilities inside of this country, and they have to be seen on individual scales, right? The sort of totality of that word immigrant kind of makes these histories seem like they belong in these sort of bundled packages, right? Like, here's the immigrant narrative on this side, here's the sort of American narrative on this side, here's the Chinese American. And I find that problematic. So, as much as possible, I believe that what you do is you carry as much of your history with you, and you accept that history is now going to be folded into this other history, and that together you're weaving this more profound narrative of our country.
Great. Yes, sir.
Okay. Salam. Salam. Good evening. My name is Antana. Our commonality is I was born in Addis. The difference is I came in when I was 16, and you were 2. And my question is for those of us who are here as an immigrant and trying to make it, congratulations again with your success. There is different trials and failures. So you've mentioned you've tried and you have felt in some of your writings, and what do you advise for those of us who are here, trying to make it here in the dream world country? How can we fight failure and also to succeed in our whatever passion we have and here in the United States?
Yeah, no, and I think it is important to point out that there's that sort of difference that happens with time, right? Coming here as a 2-year-old places you on a very different scale and very different relationship, even though later on I may have had frustrations with the idea of being American. Nonetheless, it's impossible to separate America from who I am. It's so innately a part of my cultural history, my intellectual history, that I can't ever make any distinctions between my American identity and my Ethiopian identity. Whereas at the same time, if you come here at a much later age, especially you are confronted with a larger set of problems. You know, you're confronted with questions of language, questions of history, questions of a much more intense relationship to the country that you left behind and the new one that you're forced to now create a new home in. You know, and at the same time, those are the ways in which I think the idea of the immigrant experience magnifies what is nonetheless, I think, the kind of very core human experience, right? So we talk about the immigrant narrative in a way that I think we're also using that term because what we're also doing is we're magnifying the kind of complexities of creating home and the complexities of creating new lives and challenges. The immigrant experience is that, I think, to a heightened degree. It's that to the 10th power. I don't know anybody who hasn't. I think the series of frustrations and failures, I think those are kind of endemic to all of us, right? And I think in the immigrant communities and immigrant populations, those frustrations are perhaps felt more acutely because it's easy for our lives to be more precarious because we don't necessarily always have the same historical systems, networks, families, traditions that would support you if you've been here for 3, 4, 10, 15 generations. And so when you do fail, the failure can sometimes be much more devastating and much more sort of profound. And at the same time, I do think that failure afflicts all of us. So I don't have, there's no way of making any magic words to get out of that problem, right? That is sort of what happens. You know, we try, we fail, and sometimes, if we're lucky, we can kind of overcome those failures. But inevitably, we all are sort of asked to step back up to the plate. You know, you can't not do that. You can't not do that.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yes.
Hi, my name is Christina, and I have an interpreter with me. And I'm a student from Gallaudet University, and I'm in a community class, and my interpreter has a question that I wrote for you. You write exquisite details about Logan Circle, Georgetown, and the Safa, the main character's neighborhood. Do you think if you didn't describe the setting in such a detailed manner, the story would have been different?
That's a good question. That's something I should have talked with my students about. I wish my students asked me those questions sometimes. I think that the details are a necessary reflection. The details aren't ancillary, right? The details are a necessary reflection of Seifa's relationship to this community. And so it's also very much reflective of his personality and his identity. He's not somebody who's very interested in kind of making it in this world. He's not very interested in succeeding. He's not very interested in striving to make a big career. What he is really interested in is watching and looking at the world. And I think that's one of the reasons why I like him so much as a narrator, because he gave me a chance to really look closely at DC, to look closely at this landscape, and to see how that landscape filtered through his eyes is slightly different from the landscape that we normally see. Or it's also both the landscape that we always see, but we don't notice it to the same degree. And suddenly here's a character who, because of his loss, because of his emotional state, spends more time noticing the world around him than I think most people do, than I think any of us can possibly do in our day-to-day lives. But I think part of why we enjoy fiction so much, or why we enjoy literature so much, is that it slows down time. It reminds us of how we can actually see the world in this heightened way that brings it back to life to us. It shows us the sort of inherent mystery and the inherent beauty sometimes in the physical world around us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I asked this partly because your mom is here, and I'm only interested in the lighter side of the stories. I want to know the American experiences you took home growing up as you become American that the family finds funny for whatever reason and repeats every now and then. I can just give you a quick story. A little boy went to his mom one day, kind of furious, angry, why mom, his mom was inconsiderate enough to make him the only person in the school with yellow rice. And the mom did not understand that rice wasn't supposed to be yellow in America. And I heard this from it in NPR, listening to NPR, and I found it fascinating. And even food-related stories like this, I can go on and on, but I want yours.
I don't know if I could just go around selling mine that cheaply. Plus, I'm not always very quick on the draw. Plus, telling humorous stories about myself is not something I like to do in front of strangers. At the same time, I will say one of since you asked the question, it's not so much a story, but one of those anecdotes that sometimes shows the divide in perspective, right? So, growing up my father could be quite sometimes a formal man and believed in wanting to pass on a certain level of cultural formality. Ethiopians, I think, tend to sort of be quite formal in our gestures and in our movements oftentimes. And I remember, I think I was starting 3rd grade, and we were going to Target or to the grocery. There was no Target, whatever it was, Kmart, to buy our school supplies, and I had like a Spider-Man backpack or something that I really wanted. And my father looked at it and he's just like, no way. And I was like, what do you mean no way? And he's like, I'm gonna get you a better backpack. And he goes down another aisle and he comes back with a briefcase.
That's great.
And it was like this, and it was very adorable, right? Now I'm like, yes, I really, if I knew what was really going on, I would have totally rocked the briefcase to school. I would have been beaten to a bloody pulp. But we, so we got the briefcase. I didn't get my Spider-Man backpack, and we did have to go home and like kind of fight about it. I think my mom might have been the sort of final resolution who got us eventually to have regular book bags. But for my father, it was just sort of like the end of the world, that we didn't understand how important it was to like walk outside looking your very best. Whether or not you were 8 years old, it didn't really change the equation. So.
We'll do 2 more, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the book, and then we'll go back. Yes.
Can you talk to us about the title, the poem it comes from, how you were inspired by it, and what you want us to, the connection to the book?
The initial title of the book was actually Children of the Revolution, and it's still that title in translation. It's that title in the UK. It's Children of the Revolution in most of the languages that it's been translated into, actually, because the beautiful things that heaven bears doesn't always translate well into German, is what I think I've realized. Definitely not into like Scandinavian languages. It's really awful. The French definitely loved the second title. But that was the original title, and that came from the moment in the novel where the characters are listening to this song and they're misinterpreting its intention, and they believe that they themselves are children of the revolution. And my publisher or the sales department said, yes, we like that title, but no, you can't actually put that on a book anymore, for reasons I don't always understand. But nonetheless, so I was very happy with the new title. And I chose the new title, and it comes from the last lines of Dante's Inferno, when Dante is finally sort of exiting hell, and he's allowed, before going into purgatory, he's allowed a glimpse up into heaven. And so Virgil allows him to sort of one brief fleeting glance. And he says, through a round aperture I saw appear some of the beautiful things that heaven bears. And that's one particular translation by Robert Pinsky that I really loved when I first read it. And it works, and it has lots of different resonances throughout the novel. The characters are very much concerned with a kind of search for beauty, a search with beauty within themselves primarily. They feel slightly deformed, I think, by the process of migration, by the things that they've lost, by not knowing who they are in an American context. I think that has radically ruptured their sense of who they are, and so they are consciously looking for beautiful things in their lives and for beautiful things inside of themselves. And at the same time, there's a way in which that can also be perhaps slightly reflective of what each of them kind of has to go through in their own lives. That process of migration, of fleeing home, is a kind of movement through a very difficult and dark period in their lives. And once that movement is over, there is a sense that there's something perhaps more beautiful waiting for them at the very end of it. And so you don't actually, like Dante never actually names what the beautiful things are. He just says, through a round aperture I saw appear some of the beautiful things. And there's an ambiguity there on that line where you don't know what those beautiful things are, but yet at the same time you have a sense that they're there waiting for you to get to them.
Yes.
Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us. We are all very curious to know if you already have any ideas on what the theme of your next novel will be.
The next novel, which is the third novel,
Right.
will be out next year. So I do know. It would be alarming if I didn't. But maybe answer that later if we talk about that. Or
Right, we were going to talk about there's a second novel and then the third one that's going to be published. So we'll kind of tie that up at the end. Going back to the book for this evening, one of my favorite parts of the book was the relationship or non-relationship with Naomi and Judith. And it struck me that there are some parallels in both of the stories because both the narrator and Judith and Naomi are in a sense, here but not here. Judith is coming to the neighborhood, clearly trying to make a statement about coming to a neighborhood that probably wouldn't be her own. And they strike up this very unlikely, somewhat tentative relationship, and that one thinks when you're reading, oh, this can't possibly be, and yet, I found myself kind of rooting for them. Talk a little bit about how that came to be.
Judith is, there's I guess there's one love story in the novel between the narrator and Naomi, right? That's the sort of real, not obviously romantic one, but that's the sort of real love story that happens in the novel. It's this little girl who brings him to life, who kind of animates his existence and makes it and brings him into being because finally he has something to genuinely sort of care about. And his relationship with her mother has the potential to also possibly be that. And I know in really perfect worlds, great, everyone finds the love that they have and nothing, they're able to overcome all boundaries, barriers. But I'm not really interested in trying to describe that. I think what was more interesting to me was finding two characters who despite their seemingly different histories actually converge in very unique ways, and that's part of what we oftentimes think of as the sort of African narrative or the immigrant narrative, is that we think of it to a certain degree in a certain opposition to the sort of general narrative or as an aside. And really there's so much convergence that happens in these sort of experiences, right? So Judith herself kind of operates as a migrant in the novel. She's somebody who is American fully and completely, yet at the same time is desperately looking for home. She moves constantly from place to place to place, trying to find some home that she can recreate for her family and for herself. And she goes through these elaborate measures to build this house for herself. And she loses that house. She sort of is kind of displaced again for very different reasons than, of course, the African characters in the novel. But nonetheless, that process of having to rebuild home doesn't end or begin with the immigrant experience. That's something that I think gets translated into all of our lives. Each of us are kind of forced to go through those motions. At the same time, Judith is, the divisions between her and Safe, I think it was important to note that those divisions are important, that they're not just resolved by easy gestures or by good intentions. There's divisions of class and race. Right. And for me, it's very important to intertwine those two things. So we think that sometimes we've made great strides in overcoming racial barriers, and we have, definitely, but we also have failed, I think, poorly on the class lines. And class and race are deeply intertwined inside of this country at the same time. And so we're never really having the kind of complete dialogue that we should be having sometimes. And Judith and Seifa have these moments where they could possibly actually be able to create something together, and yet there are all these little fault lines that interrupt them because they don't have a language in order to actually say what's lying at the core of both of their wounds. They don't actually have an ability to express that. And so rather than being able to communicate, they just fail. They fall apart.
Right. It seems you're also making some statements about progress, gentrification, the displacement that comes from economic progress that wrecks neighborhoods or changes neighborhoods, and whereas we want to preserve some diversity in the sake of progress and moving forward, those themes are also present, and that is, in a sense, another kind of migration.
Yeah, without a doubt. When I was living in DC, especially when I was first writing that book, and many of you maybe remember Logan Circle in the city from the 90s, the radical transformation was just sort of stunning to me. You're just like, how did this happen overnight? There was this, and it's beautiful, this great big beautiful mansion right on the circle, this white one that we used to call the Scooby-Doo house because it had been completely dilapidated for so many years, and it looked exactly like that mansion. Like it looked, no one lived there. It was completely blacked out, and then now it's this great, stunning townhouse, and it was able to transform so rapidly. And you think, well, there has to be there's something problematic about that, right? And it's not just to use the label gentrification. Yes, that's the sort of term we use, but that only gets at part of the problem. You know, you want these communities to be better. You want these houses to be restored. You want communities to be able to thrive. And yet at the same time, they can only seem to thrive when it involves displacement of others. And that becomes the more problematic issue. It's like, how do you actually kind of create a sustainable movement of empowerment, of community development that's not predicated on the loss of somebody else's, that's not predicated on the removal of someone else. Right,
exactly. The other part that, again, this is the uncle. I found myself drawn to him several times, where Cephas goes back to the apartment and to his favorite place in the closet, digs out the box of correspondence that is going back for, I guess, some couple of decades maybe. All of the correspondence typed neatly, addressed to cabinet officials and presidents, and how he was, I don't know, I couldn't read them as anything but entreaties. You know, someone pay attention, someone notice what's going on in this country. Our country and Ethiopia have a wonderful relationship. Please be aware that this is going on. It was kind of that Willy Loman attention must be paid sort of thing. And I was just so interested in how you were able to weave that into the story as well.
I mean, that came so naturally. I think that seems to be quite a common experience that I've known across all immigrant lines. I mean, not only from Ethiopia, but really from general, almost anyone you do. Part of what happens when you come here is you feel like you have a government that you can perhaps actually engage in directly. And there's a great comfort in feeling that as well, that you can actually pick up the phone and you can call the White House, and that seems greatly empowering, greatly rewarding, and greatly promising, and yet at the same time you have to recognize the great political divide that exists between that action and the reality of actually changing anything systematic inside of your country, and that sometimes you feel like you have made this great, that you can talk to somebody, and at the same time, who are you actually talking to at the end of the day? There's a kind of silence at the end of the phone line, and that silence is deeply sort of haunting for the uncle, and it also echoes a passage in Saul Bellows' Mr. Herzog, where one of Saul Bellows' characters is walking around New York City and writing letters because he's partly losing his mind, and he's writing letters to historical figures, political figures, and he's doing it because he's trying to find some form of engagement, right? So if you have loss and you don't know what to do, you don't know who to address your problems to, your country is falling apart, you know, you address it to the highest person in the land. You write to the president, and that's actually not going to change anything, but there's a kind of necessity, you know, that desperation demands some form of action, and so you act the only way you possibly think you can, which is to write a letter.
Right. I just found that incredibly poignant. This would maybe be a good time for you to read. Okay.
Since we talked briefly about the title, I thought I would read a brief passage that makes a little tour of Washington, D.C., and gives you a hint of or tells you exactly where the original title came from and why it's not that title, perhaps anymore. At 6 p.m., the temperature is still hovering near 80, a definite sign of an impending hot and brutal summer. The few people who pass through the store at this time of day come in with their faces red and shiny with sweat. They stock up on bottled water before returning to their early evening strolls and centrally air-conditioned homes. I make a mental note to myself. If possible, buy more water. I watch an old beat-up Chevy drive around the circle 3 times looking for something or someone that is no longer there. The sun makes the leftover rain on the roof sparkle as it winds around the block. There's a slow, lumbering quality to the day. I keep the air conditioner off and the door open. Joseph and Kenneth come to the store together this time. They arrive almost an hour earlier than usual. Kenneth is still dressed in a suit and Joseph's wearing jeans with a University of Michigan sweatshirt that's far too heavy for the warm May night. Joseph kisses me once on the cheek. With the store still open, Kenneth has nothing to say, so he shakes my hand while trying out his new English accent. How you doing, old chap? Life's treating you well these days. The two of them stand on opposite sides of the counter, leaning against the glass panes while flipping through the day's newspapers. By most accounts, it has been a decent day for the world. Inflation is low. Countries all across the globe are negotiating deals, hammering out truces while their leaders shake hands on the cover of the Washington Post, under headlines of restored hope and promises of cooperation. Even Africa has done well for itself today. Look, Kenneth calls out, holding open a copy of the newspaper so we can see the picture of Laurent Kabila he's tapping proudly. Laurent is coming through. He reads the brief article with ironic enthusiasm. There are only 150 words to the entire piece. At 7:30, I close the door to the store. Neither Joseph nor Kenneth asks me why I'm closing early or whether it's been a good day since no one has entered since they arrived. I don't add up the register because I've already done the math in my head. I know just how little I've earned. I pull a handful of bills out of the drawer and stuff them into my pocket as if they're inconsequential. Kenneth throws his arm around my shoulder and says, "Come on, Stefanos. It's time to leave." He squeezes my shoulder once, firmly for encouragement. Without asking or worrying about where we're going, I get into Kenneth's car with the two of them, and we pull away from the store. We drive past my house and what's left of Judith's without pausing at the stop sign on the corner. The idea is to leave this neighborhood and store as quickly as possible, to rush headlong into the sun which is just now setting. The entire flat skyline of the city is tinged with a pinkish hue that hardly seems real. We roll our windows down. In the back seat, Joseph puts his feet up and closes his eyes as the wind whips over his face. We all breathe in deeply. Kenneth cuts down one narrow side street after another to avoid traffic. The trees, flowers, and bushes are all in bloom. There's something unsettling about spring in D.C., the cautionary tale of overindulgence and inflated expectations that seems embedded in the grass and in the trees. I thought I'd long since learned to keep those expectations in check. But it happens anyway, doesn't it? We forget who we are and where we came from, and in doing so believed we are entitled to much more than we deserve. In just a few minutes, we pull up in front of the Royal Castle, which from outside still looks like the Chinese restaurant it had once been. The red awning and generic Asian typeface cast against a gold background stayed even after the menu had been reduced to buffalo wings, French fries, and hamburgers, and the large circular booths with the lazy Susans were replaced with stages, poles, and a row of chairs that remind me of a high school auditorium. The drinks are $10 and each one lasts for exactly 3 songs, which is equal to 3 dancers, which means we're spending about $1 a minute, and that in 68 minutes I will have spent all the money I earned that day. I take my last dollar out of my pocket and lay it out on the table. Once that's done, so am I say. Joseph slides the bill back to me. "Keep it," he says. "The rest of the evening is on me." There's nothing left of downtown D.C. by the time we walk outside. The city has emptied itself of its bureaucrats, politicians, lawyers, secretaries, diplomats, lobbyists, and bankers. The shutters are all pulled down in front of all the storefronts, and graffiti has been scrawled all over them. Beso, East Capitol Crew. The only people we pass on the street are all well-dressed and well-heeled, on their way home to the suburbs of Virginia or to one of the handful of those luxurious restaurants that stand as clearly isolated from one another as a pair of trees in an open plain. The Capitol's white dome seems to hover in front of us, and if I turn just a little to the right, I could see the red eye sitting at the peak of the Washington Monument. There is no mystery left in any of those buildings for us, and at times, I wonder how there ever could have been. We decide to end our evening at a small, dark, crowded bar on the northwest edge of the city. The crowd tonight is mixed. A half-dozen Nigerians, all friends with the owner, are pressed against the bar, ordering drinks and shots for one another. At the other end is an old white man with a beard drinking slowly. Scattered throughout the booths and tables at the back are a couple dozen young white kids, the first to live in this neighborhood in 30 years. Kenneth and I slide into a booth and begin to drink. Joseph goes to the back of the bar and puts $1 into the jukebox. We've been waiting for this moment to one degree or another since our first drink of the night. It takes about 15 minutes before the song begins, and with the first chord, we raise our glasses in toast. When the refrain starts, the 3 of us lean forward and sing along. But you won't fool the children of the revolution. No, you won't fool the children of the revolution. Over and over until the song ends, by which point we've all finished our drinks and are ready for another. The first time we heard that song, we were sitting 2 booths farther back. We still worked at the Capitol Hotel. Joseph and Kenneth were sharing an apartment just a few blocks away. The song played and Joseph stood up and drunkenly declared, "That is us. We are the children of the revolution." His accent was heavier then, weighted with tinges of French that struggled under a formal locution to come through. It took him several tries before we understood what he was saying, each attempt punctuated by emphatic thrust toward the air holding the music, and in holding the music, holding Joseph as well. When we finally did understand him, Kenneth and I stood up, and together the three of us nodded our heads to the words we barely understood, the refrain repeating its unintended sympathies over and over. Now, when the song is over, it's hard not to laugh at our misplaced enthusiasm. We had been in America for only a couple of years when we first heard it, and we did believe that we were children of a revolution. And not only because we were willing to be grand. We all had stories of families we missed and would never see again. We spoke in our broken English of Africa's tyrannies, which had yet to grow tedious, and we had our own stories of death and violence to match. The song plays 2 more times over the course of the next 2 hours, and each time, like children being coaxed into a conversation, we sing along.
Great, thank you. Thank you. We'll talk about the next books, okay? How to Read the Air is Dinaw's second book, and the one to be published next year is All Our Names. So they're connected in some way.
Yeah, they're all, I didn't necessarily know they were all connected when I began writing them. You know, Beautiful Things is told from the point of view of a young man who's migrated to America as a teenager, and How to Read the Air is told from multiple points of view, but the dominant one is from the point of view of a young man born inside of America with this legacy of Africa behind him. And the third novel, which is just being wrapped up now, takes place, again, I have this idea of convergence, right? This way in which we tend to think of our country's history as being very disparate and very distinct from other nations. And yet at the same time, there are these interesting points of collision that can happen in history. And so around the late 1960s, at the same time that you have a lot of independence happening throughout the continent, you have Uganda becoming independent in 1962. 1963, you have Martin Luther King giving the I Dream speech from the Washington Monument. You have this sort of great surge of hope and optimism across both countries at the same time, all of which begins to sort of collapse under what happens in the years immediately afterwards. So then you have the sort of problems that arise from the Vietnam War. You have the death of Martin Luther King and the race riots. You end up having a legacy of political violence and dictatorships from the same men who we once thought were going to be sort of great leaders of the next generation. So the next novel is set half in America, half in Africa, and in a country that would resemble Uganda, Kampala a lot, in exactly those moments just after we stopped dreaming to a certain degree. We were kind of forced to look at where we were. And so the first part takes place from the point of view of a couple of young men who want to be students and who are sort of dreaming of becoming students inside of what would be Makerere University in Kampala and never get there, of course, because otherwise it wouldn't be a novel. It's like, what's the difference between a good novel, a novel about a wedding, or a novel about a marriage, and a bad novel about a marriage? It's the good novel about the marriage ends. The bad novel is the one where they just get to stay happily ever after. Somehow.
We understand. We get it.
And the second part takes place in a college town in America, and it brings the African characters into an American context. And so we're looking same questions of sort of race, but from a different historical
perspective. Okay, great, thanks. If you could queue up with the microphone, that'd be great, thanks.
I've got a question about your writing process. You mentioned that on your first novel, the muse found you on 18th Street. One day you went home and you wrote several pages, and then you said it was several months before you continued on. I believe that's what I heard you say earlier. How do you approach that? What typically happens when you're writing a novel? I'm just curious to know what gets you going when you.
They tend to always because I can never really write short. Like, I've never been able to write a good short story, which would be great because that gives you a chance to sort of to get a lot of things out in different forms, different mediums. It doesn't take 3 to 4 years out of your life. So all the novels I've been writing recently, actually the next one has begun before the first one was over. So while this one was almost done writing, the second one kind of began as it started gestating in my head. And so I was writing that quietly, bit by bit, but without any sense of urgency because I was still finishing up the first one. And now the third one began in the middle of the night while I was in the process of doing the edits on the second one. So there was a way in which part of it is you just have this anxiety, like, what am I going to do next? So I need to sort of like, your brain starts trying rapidly to find something interesting to say next. But then at the same time, I tend to let things kind of sit for a little bit, so that way I can make sure it's something that I actually want to spend that much time, because it's a really long time. That's what I've realized. It takes so many years that I really want to make sure that I believe in where the work is going to go before I commit to it.
Yes.
Yeah, the novel is what I guess I think of as nonlinear. It jumps back and forth in time, and it works very well to me in this novel, and some it doesn't. This is the first time I've had a chance to ask an author about that technique. Was it something conscious that you decided to structure it that way, or did it just work out that way, or how does that process work?
It was very, very conscious. I've tended to have a very big concerns about the structural forms that novels take, and that as much as possible, your structure just should try to mirror your relationship to reality. And in this particular case, the characters are deeply tied to their past, and so that sort of oscillation between past and present, I think, kind of better reflects our experiences. The past is kind of constantly intruding on our present moment. It's constantly interrupting our present lives. Every time we're in the present moment, we're always being reminded of something from our past. And so I wanted the structure of the novel to be able to mirror that sort of dynamic relationship between past and present. It's very much, I think we're always in conversation with our personal history, and so we're always trying to engage our past in order to understand how to move forward in our lives. And part of the narrator's frustration with his problem is that he's never really engaged his past. He's remained stagnant in his present moment because he's never spent much time trying to really resolve who he is and how he's become this person. And so structurally, the novel tries to actually mimic that same psychological movement.
Yes.
Have you read the book Cutting for Stone? And if you have, do you have any comments on it?
I haven't. I think just about every other person in America has. But I'm waiting until everyone has, and then I'll jump on the bandwagon. But I've heard very wonderful things about it.
Dinaw, I have a question about, and most writers don't like answering this question, but about...
So you ask it anyway?
I'm going to ask it and see what happens. About audiences. You never think of your audience when you write a book. I assume you don't. Most people don't. But if, I'm thinking about you, Junot Diaz, Edwidge Danticat, others who are kind of, seen here as authors who illuminate the immigrant experience in this American context. A young man in Ethiopia, if he picked up this book or woman and read it, what piece would they find, do you think? Like, what would they connect to in the stories that you write?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard a lot. I mean, I've spoken to audiences in Ethiopia, and I received lots of Facebook messages from people inside of Ethiopia about how they respond to the book, and they tend to be quite warm. I think a lot of them are surprised that they seem to feel like I'm offering a very pessimistic portrayal of life in America, which oftentimes is a response that I hear, especially when I'm outside of this country, and which is not at all my intent, right? It's not to be pessimistic about America by any means. It's just to sort of argue that it's oftentimes from the outside we have these, we still think of America as in such great grand terms of enormous possibility of everyone has wealth, and we forget the kind of struggles that really most people in this country have to go through, regardless of whether they're migrants or not. Obviously, you can see the way our economy has been functioning, that we have a lot of people who are having a very hard time in this country, and who have had a very hard time in this country for a long time. So I think part of it is I think they're interested and engaged by that. And at the same time, it's true. I always say that I never think of my audience, because you're writing literary fiction. So when you begin writing your first novel, your audience, if you're lucky, will consist of your mom. And that's like, and even that won't happen because you'll never give it to her. So your audience is, you know how small your audience can possibly be. And yet at the same time, you are very aware of that you're engaging a literary history and tradition and form, even if nobody ever sees it. And so part of when I talked about the sort of first terrible novel that I wrote, all the characters in that novel were named like Bill and Henry and Tom, and they were neither black nor white. They didn't live in any particular real city in the world, because I didn't know how to I was afraid to give them the specificity that had any relationship to my own life. And so when I first began writing this novel, and I remember very clearly writing Sefa Stefanos, which is a name that my grandfather wanted to give to me, I was acutely aware of putting this name into a novel. That it was a novel, that it was a name that had a resonance inside of Ethiopia, that all the characters have names that are based from members of my family, and that you're bringing these characters into this like American literary landscape, and you're kind of anxious about whether or not they belong to a certain degree. So it's not so much, you're not thinking of the particular readers, but you are thinking about the kind of cultural reception that your book might hit on.
Other questions? Why the Brothers Karamazov? For those of you who haven't read the book, it's the one that Naomi chooses to have Sefa read aloud to her, and this is how they begin their very intense friendship. And
people have said, why would a little girl want to read that? And it's true, a little girl probably doesn't want to read it, but she wants to read it because it's a big book. That's really what brings her to that. It's because she wants to keep this man with her for as long as possible. And here's the way of doing it. Here's a very big novel. And then also personally, because I love that novel. And the way that novel ends, you're always kind of skeptical about novels that offer you sort of really beautiful resolutions, and yet that novel ends on such a moment of grace and beauty that I wanted to find some way of just bringing that back into this story.
So what's next after your novel gets finished? I'm assuming that you're already at work on a fourth.
Not.
Not.
I'm taking a break now.
Taking a break. Okay.
34. I deserve a break. No. What's next is a project that I'm working on the side, which is trying to find a way to allow people inside of Africa, right, to actually tell the stories from themselves. I think part of it becomes slightly frustrating is someone like me or other writers who live in the diaspora. We shouldn't be saying as many things that we do say about a continent this large. And I've done a lot of work as a journalist in Africa. I think I know a fair amount about it. And I've traveled across the continent in many ways. But at the same time, because that voice is still coming by and large from the outside, just because I'm more perhaps sensitive to it doesn't make it any less outside. So the next thing is to try to find a way of creating a platform for African narratives to actually start engaging themselves and the world on their own terms.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful
Thank you all very much.
conversation. We will have book signing over here, and stick around and have conversations with our distinguished author and guest or among yourselves, but I think it was a terrific evening. Thank you.